Hi, everybody. All right, cool. All right. Wow, thanks so much, everybody. Really excited with the turnout here. Today we have our LEC seminar with the grad student invited speaker, and we are really happy to have here today Kelly Zamudio from UT Austin. Kelly was born in California, and early on in her family immigrated to Peru and then Brazil, where she was raised. Kelly received her BA from UC Berkeley, her PhD from University of Washington, and was a postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley. She began her tenure-track job at Cornell in 2000, where she mentored and advised many undergrads, including me, for which she received the Robert and Donna Paul Advising Award in 2009, the College Graduate Advising Award in 2014, and the Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellowship in 2018. In 2021, Kelly joined the Department of Integrated Biology at UT Austin, where she's actively involved in mentorship and campus-wide efforts to improve the climate for diverse students in science. Kelly's research focuses on the evolutionary processes leading to the origin of biodiversity in the highly biodiverse tropics. Kelly's interests in education research focus on new teaching strategies that engage all students, including those from groups that typically do not engage in STEM careers. She was elected to the Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019 for her scholarly contributions to the field of organismal and evolutionary biology. And I really gotta say, I wouldn't be here right now if it wasn't for Kelly. Thank you so much, and it's so great to have you. Okay, and we'll have questions at the end. We'll pass the mic around.
All right. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Sean, for that lovely introduction. I have to say, it's really wonderful thing about mentoring undergrads is actually seeing them evolve in their careers, and Sean is one of the ones that I have mentored, and it's thank you for inviting me. So it's great to be here and share with you some of the work we've been doing in my lab. I wanted to give sort of a broader overview for this talk, so I'll be talking about some newer stuff and some older stuff, just to sort of give you a bigger picture. I'm going to try to hit these three subtopics, talk a little bit about mating systems and frogs, sexual selection and mate choice are two of the things that I'm very interested in. Then I'll switch over and talk a little bit about the amphibian pandemic, the chytrid fungus, and some of the dynamics of that infectious emergent disease. And then if I have time at the end, I'll tell you just a tiny snippet about some of the work we've been trying to do in Brazil to rediscover some of the frogs that have disappeared, likely because of the pandemic, but not only for that reason, using environmental DNA. Okay, so let's start with mating systems. So one of the things about frogs that makes them unique among terrestrial vertebrates is that they have a really large number of reproductive modes. So what do I mean by reproductive modes? Well, Salty and Duhlman defined this quite a while ago, and they said reproductive mode in frogs is a combination of traits that includes oviposition site, ovum and clutch characteristics, rate and duration of development, stage and size of hatchling, and type of parental care, if any. So that's a mouthful, right? And you can see right off the bat that reproductive mode is not a single phenotype or a single character. It's actually a complex character, which makes it particularly interesting to some of us, but also makes it a little bit intractable, right, to try to understand. So it's a bunch of sort of loosely associated aspects about reproduction that together make reproductive mode. So if you think of it that way, you can understand, and if you think about the biphasic life cycle of frogs, why there are so many reproductive modes. A lot of reproductive mode has to do about where you put your eggs, where your tadpoles develop before they metamorphose into juveniles, and then once they metamorphose, on top of it, some species decide to care for one life stage or another, or both. Okay, so you can imagine, let's just think about egg placement. Frogs put eggs everywhere possible, some including in arboreal and terrestrial settings, others retaining eggs on or in their own bodies. Okay, so if we think of that variation, combine that with all possible combinations of where their tadpoles develop, plus on top of it add parental care, and that's why we have so many reproductive modes. Okay? So the main idea behind the interest in reproductive modes was that it was always viewed as a clear example of a progression in this complex phenotype. And the reason it was viewed as a progression is because as you move down this list, you're basically becoming increasingly independent from bodies of water. And at the same time, you're also becoming increasingly dependent on some form of parental involvement, especially if you include parental care, right? So those two things together led people to infer that as you went towards more derived reproductive modes, what you were actually doing was maximizing your fitness by protecting your offspring, either eggs or tadpoles, from predation. So the main explanation here for this, all this variation in reproductive modes, was basically that natural selection optimizes reproductive modes in any one context to minimize loss of fitness because of predation. So that was great. We're all very excited about variation in reproductive modes, those of us who study it. And then about 10 years ago, this paper came out, and we were all very excited about it. It was published by Gomez Mestre and his collaborators. And we were very excited about it because it was the first systematic review on the phylogeny of frogs of how many reproductive modes or how reproductive modes had evolved. And they found a number of interesting things. Well, they used the phylogeny, first of all, and looked at the number of transitions between various categories of reproductive modes. They found that there was more diversity in reproductive modes in the tropics. We already knew that, but that was cool to confirm. They posited that the reason that there were fewer reproductive modes in temperate zones had to do with limits, abiotic limits, and the ability of eggs and tadpoles to survive in various areas. But perhaps the most interesting thing they found is that it's really not a linear progression. Okay? There are a lot of transitions, complex transitions among different states of what we call reproductive modes, and it's not like this single selective march towards increasing terrestriality. Nonetheless, despite this lability that they found, they end up concluding in the paper that escape from predation must have happened multiple times in the frog tree of life. Going back to this idea that the main driver of this variation and this complex phenotype is natural selection. So at the time, I and a number of colleagues had been thinking a lot about reproductive modes, and I want to call out here two people in specific. Célio Haddad is a close collaborator, and Cíntia Prado, another close collaborator from Brazil, and those two people probably have the most field experience in terms of neotropical frogs and neotropical frog reproduction. And so we sat around, all of us, thinking, well, why does it always have to be about predation, right? What, really? Why is this all about predation? I mean, couldn't there be something else going on? And the reason we thought to ask this is because all of us had seen in various contexts in the field, in the neotropics, that there's quite a lot going on at the time of amplexus and at the time of reproduction that has nothing to do with predation at all. Okay, so for example, all of us have seen that there are a number of frog mating systems that involve pretty intense competition, both between males and females, in terms of maximizing their own reproductive success via fertilization. Okay, so for example, we have cases where we have satellite males. This isn't in the tropics, but it's a nice example of satellite males here in one of our own Northern American toads. Here's a calling toad at the edge of a pond trying to attract a female. And you have a little silent toad. This particular toad won't make any noise, won't defend its territory. It just waits until a female comes and will try to jump on and fertilize some of the female's eggs. So that's a satellite or a sneaker male. We also have a number of cases of multi-male spawning. So this leptodactylid here from the Pantanal of Brazil creates a basin within which a male calls to attract a female. Here's the amplecting male and female right here. They start depositing eggs, and all these males just make a circle around and throw sperm into the basin in hopes of fertilizing some of that female's eggs. So that's multi-male spawning. And then finally, we also have even more forms of competition like this. This is an explosive or a scramble mating system. Everybody's there at the same time. Females come in to reproduce into a pond, and this right here is a ball of high-lid frogs in the Atlantic coastal forests of Brazil. And somewhere in the middle there is a female who's depositing eggs, and all those males are vying, especially by trying to approximate their cloacas to the female's cloaca to fertilize some of her eggs. So all of this variation led us to think, well, maybe there's a role for sexual selection. There's some very good reasons that both males and females might want to have a little more control over their reproduction, right? And so maybe getting out of the water actually affords them the opportunity to have that control, right? Either in enforcing choice or in the choice itself. So we set out to ask the question, is it possible that there's something about terrestriality that has to do with sexual selection? And what we did was categorize all the frogs from the Gomez-Mestre paper and the families that we were interested in into whether their amplexus was actually exposed, meaning if it was out in the open where other males and females could see it, or whether it was actually hidden or concealed. So here's an example. This hylet right here creates a basin. You can see all the eggs floating on the surface of the water. The little male is there guarding it. That is a terrestrial mode of reproduction because he is out of the main body of water, but it is still exposed, right? In contrast, this Leptodactylus here creates a little volcano nest, calls from within the volcano nest, and then attracts a female. The female goes in, and the amplexus happens inside the volcano nest. And so that is a concealed amplexus, okay? All right, so we categorized everybody in the data set, did a number of different analyses. We focused on hylids and leptodactylids, which were the two groups that we had most data for. And I'll just show you the results from leptodactylids here. And basically asked questions about which modes or which characters that are part of the reproductive mode phenotype actually were evolving in concert on the phylogeny. And we looked on the phylogeny and did a number of different correlated character change analyses, and the only two characters that actually came out as correlated on the tree were where an individual places their egg and whether the amplexus is exposed or hidden, okay? Those two traits evolve dependently in the direction you would predict, okay? If you are moving towards a more terrestrial amplexus, you tend to have a more hidden amplexus, okay? So we did this by reconstructing correlated transitions, and basically, let me just point out here that this is what we presume is the ancestral state from our ancestral state reconstruction, that aquatic eggs and exposed amplexus were where the family started, and basically all the transitions are pushing this pair of characters towards terrestrial egg and hidden amplexus, evolutionarily, so to speak, through this correlated change. So that was kind of cool. We thought, well, that's interesting. Hidden amplexus is strongly correlated with terrestriality in some way, and exposed amplexus is correlated with aquatic eggs. Maybe there's something, and this was true for hylids as well, maybe there's something about this correlation that is one of the drivers. So we published this paper a few years ago in American Naturalist. A couple of takeaways we had is that it's not all about predation. Possibly, it probably isn't. This doesn't mean that predation is not important. Obviously, predation is definitely an important selective environment, but there might be something else going on here. We also, in this exercise, figured out the lack of data that we actually have in terms of some of the behaviors and involved during the mating process in frogs. So we need a lot more observations and species-specific studies to really get at the selective mechanisms driving some of these traits. But our biggest takeaway was that by focusing on one mechanism, on selection alone and not sexual selection, that we might be missing out on all sorts of really interesting biology and all sorts of really interesting mechanisms. Okay, so why am I telling you that story? That was published a long time ago. I'm telling you that story because that was the first time, I think, in my career that I actually realized that it's not just the question you ask, but it's how you ask the question, right? So we didn't collect any new data from the Gomez-Mestre paper. We just asked the question of those data in a different way. And most importantly, we asked that question based on the experiences we had had with those organisms in the field, okay? So that exercise led me into the phase of my career that I call like the parentage phase, I guess we could call it. I'm still in this phase, but it's basically this kind of ridiculous curiosity about what is happening out there at the moment of amplexus, and what is driving fitness of males and females, and who's making choices. And so we all put our heads together and went on this search for any kind of mating system that we knew of in Brazil that might have some aspect of this interesting interaction between sexual and natural selection. And mostly aided by parentage analyses and kinship analyses, we looked at a bunch of different systems. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about these last two here, because I think they're some of the coolest, but we've discovered some parentage analyses are amazing. I mean, pretty much anything you look at, you're going to be surprised by something. And that certainly has been the case here. Okay, so let me tell you about this study first, just very briefly. So this was led up by my graduate student, Fabio Gissac, who's now a postdoc at University of Campinas. And he looked at this genus Cycloranthus. Cycloranthus is one of my favorite genera of frogs. I really like them. They come in two different flavors. The first flavor is what we call Saxicolus. This is the sort of the typical way you think of a frog. It lives along a body of water, in this case, high gradient mountain streams in the Atlantic coastal forest. It defends territories, the males do. It calls, the females come, there's amplexus, the tadpoles develop right there in the male's territory, and the territorial size is thought to be what determines the fitness of the males. The other flavor of Cycloranthus is actually completely gone subterraneous. They're terrestrial, and they breed inside of little chambers that the males excavate on ground away from the stream. And the tadpoles are actually endotrophic, meaning they feed off of yolk inside of that little chamber and they don't go to the water at all. Okay, so this is almost completely opposite in terms of hidden amplexus, right? This is completely exposed and this is completely hidden. So the first thing we did for this group was reconstruct the phylogeny, do some ancestral reconstruction, and what we find is that almost certainly the ancestral